extend a big thank you to Ian for that fantastic discussion about the future. As scary as it may well sound, it is happening. And I think this session, really what we're looking to do is to kind of take it back a little bit, but equally to try and understand a bit more about what the challenges are today, how is things evolving. So this is plenary session 6. We're going to be looking at new technologies and innovation, and whether it's an opportunity or a threat for economic development. I think many of us in this room are from governments, particularly from emerging markets. This is a very real challenge now that we're facing. We're facing a very unknown, uncertain future. So the aim is this: we're going to try and debate the following question. And the question we're going to try and debate is, are developing countries at higher risk of losing jobs and investment due to the adoption of technological applications, such as automation, such as robotics, or through offshoring to lower cost locations with large talent pools? So in order to begin, I would like to first of all thank the organizers of AIM for putting together this excellent panel and for inviting me to moderate this session. Immediately to my left here, I'm joined by JJ Price. JJ is the Business Development Manager at Spread from Kyoto in Japan. Spread is a very exciting company. I'm sure you're going to look forward to listening more to what he has to say on this one, but Spread is one of the leading companies for vertical farming over the past 10 years. Next along, I'm joined by John Tamney. John is a senior fellow in economics at the Reason Foundation and editor of Real Clear Markets and author of 2 books. Who Needs the Fed? Again, it might be worth following up with him afterwards if you wanted to discuss that. And also Popular Economics. After that, we're joined by Dr. Ohan Balian, who's the chief economist at Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And for the past 3 years, he's been involved in the formulation and refinement of the 5-year Abu Dhabi plan, the Abu Dhabi Industrial Strategy, and the Abu Dhabi Competitiveness Report, amongst others. Prior to this, Dr. Ohan was the economic advisor at the Executive Office of His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the UAE Vice President and ruler of Dubai, where he actively participated in the formulation of the 10-year Dubai Strategic Plan, the fruits of which we will see today. Next along, I'm joined by Mr. Mohammed Suleiman, who is a senior Indian Administrative Service Officer from the government of Madhya Pradesh. He has 27 years of administrative experience across the power, road, and industrial sectors. He is a pioneer of the PPP, public-private partnership model, across these industries, and currently is holding the post of Principal Secretary of Commerce, Industry and Employment and Science and Technology in the state of Madhya Pradesh. And finally, we're joined on the end there by Dr. Ross McKenzie, who is the founder and CEO of the Startup Business. He's based in the city. He's come a long way. He's come all the way from Sydney, Australia. His company provides technology and robotic automation outsourcing expertise to startups and SMBs globally. He is also the director of FICON, an Indian-based outsourcing company. So he's a highly regarded expert in this field as well. So I think you can see by the caliber of people we have on this panel that we've got lots of interesting insights that we can provide you on this one. Again, building upon what Ian was saying in the last session there, we look at the rise of the robot. Obviously, we're reading conflicting reports about what does this mean. I think obviously there was a bit of scaremongering, maybe it's scaremongering, maybe not, and maybe we can discuss that, when the report was released for Davos that said up to 5 million jobs could potentially be lost by 2020 as a result of automation and robots. We also live in a time of anti-globalization sentiment. That, I believe, is cyclical and will change. We've also got a history of companies seeking efficiencies through lower cost locations. How's the outsourcing model changing? Also, there were some infographics that have been put out recently looking at the countries most likely to be impacted by automation. You've got countries like Ethiopia, for example. They estimate up to 85% of jobs could be lost due to automation or could be impacted by the introduction of automation. And finally, there's a new topic that's emerging that's being discussed quite widely today, which is around universal basic income. Is it a realistic prospect, and who pays for this? Well, hopefully in this session we can start really delving into some of those areas. So what I'd like to do first of all is open up the floor to JJ Price to give us the investor's perspective. So JJ, I'm just wondering, can you provide us some background on spread, and in particular the adoption of automation and the reasons why?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction. So, as mentioned, Spread is one of the leading companies in vertical farming. I know some people are probably not too aware what this is. This is basically a form of indoor vegetable production where we grow lettuce on stacked layers using artificial lighting, hydroponics, to grow inside of a closed and controlled environment. And what this means is that traditionally in agriculture, it's highly dependent on the outside climate, but doing it inside of indoor production unit, you basically eliminate this concern, and you can have year-round stable production in a very high-quality way. So we've been doing this in Japan for about 10 years at a very large scale. The current production facility that we have produces about 2 tons of lettuce per day, and this is year-round, regardless of how hot or cold it gets outside. What we're doing now is including automation into the system to further reduce labor costs and things like that. And I know a lot of you are already thinking, why go ahead and build this technology? You have free sunlight. There's people working outside. It seems like a very expensive way to grow something like lettuce. Basically, the environment in Japan it's a shrinking society. So in particular, if you look at the agriculture industry, the average age of a farmer is 67 years old. Japan is not a country that has a lot of migrant workers. It's mainly 99% domestic, I would say. And we're seeing more and more people move from the rural areas into the cities. So it's very hard to attract people into agriculture. So it's kind of a dying industry there. So what we're trying to do with this technology is to kind of address these concerns. In Japan, we have small amount of land. The labor force is not attracted to agriculture, which is why we're kind of pushing and forced to go into this direction to find a way to produce locally in Japan.
So that's interesting. So the whole concept in terms of how you got into this was partly forced upon you, to looking at how you can grow your business out within the limitations. Now, from your website, I've read a bit more into that and understand that you're obviously looking to expand. I think most companies today are looking at ways that they can expand their businesses. Are you happy to share a bit of light in terms of which countries you're considering for investment? And what are the key location factors that are particularly important for a company such as Spread?
Sure. So I would say the factors that kind of pushed us forward into developing this technology, we can kind of see the need for this in other regions around the world. Some things that we've included in this technology is the ability to recycle the water used in cultivation up to 98%. So this means that regions of the world that are dealing with water scarcity issues, using our technology, we're allowing them to have a means to produce locally and not just rely on imports. As we look into the future, things like trade, offshore labor, and those kinds of things are kind of unstable and it's unpredictable. So we're seeing more and more countries very interested in how to bring local production when it comes to food, and this is one way to do it. And again, at first we developed this technology for Japan to address the concerns forcing Japan to go into this direction, but we started to see how this technology could easily translate to other regions. So being able to grow, in the desert, in the cold tundra is very attractive to other regions in the world. So we're really looking at the agricultural sectors in each region to see what are the concerns that this kind of solution can address. So as we look into places like Russia or the Middle East, we see the need. There's basically no local agriculture sector. So the need to just grow produce is something that's very attractive in those regions. If we look at North America, although agriculture is very robust and a very big industry there are other factors such as the overuse of pesticides. People want more organic or clean produce, and our technology can provide solutions in those arenas as well. So this is a very holistic kind of way to bring various solutions to the agriculture sector around the world.
That's fascinating. I think that is obviously a very useful to get a good introduction to spread there and a bit more insight into how you're looking to grow out your business. What I'd like to do now is to turn this to the public sector and to Suleiman from Madhya Pradesh. Now, obviously, we've all heard and we've read about the success of Make in India, which is obviously under Prime Minister Modi's watch. And in particular, we look at recent investments into the states, such as Hindustan Coca-Cola's bottling plant in Hoshangabad. Do you see automation and robotics posing a threat to long-term job creation in the state?
Well, thank you so much. I come from a state of Madhya Pradesh, which is central state in India. Make in India is a campaign launched by the Honorable Prime Minister of India. The whole idea is try and attract investment to India and the manufacturing job creation in India. In fact, we believe that technology, it doesn't really result into any job losses. It just changes the way jobs are done from one field to other as certain new fields are created. Primarily, Madhya Pradesh is an agrarian economy and where 70% population actually depends on agriculture. So when the technology come in, the job changes in terms of first, initially when the farmers were there doing the manual work, it shifts to gear manufacturers, the tractor manufacturers, things like that with the automation coming into it. We see this opportunity of FDI in especially plants like Coca-Cola to be a great opportunity for us. You know, the Coca-Cola is already in touch with the local farmers. They were earlier producing soybean and wheat and rice. They are now thinking in terms of producing fruits and vegetables so that food processing part can be taken up by Coca-Cola. So these are always opportunity of job creation and economic growth, which is in the interest of our country and our state particularly.
Okay, interesting. And turning it to the offshoring perspective, I mean, do you see a threat in terms of as labor costs increase? I mean, we look at what's happened in China. China's seeing a dramatic increase in labor costs, which is not necessarily making it uncompetitive because it still remains a competitive location, but it's certainly changed. A lot of the lower skilled manufacturing has been moved offshore to different locations, such as Bangladesh, for example, in the textile sector. Is outsourcing to lower cost locations a threat as well, or do you see that as something that's not a major threat to what you're doing?
See, outsourcing is a reality and which we have to accept. Ultimately, the economic model will say that you need to produce at places where the cost of production is low so that you can market them more efficiently. We understand this need. We know Bangladesh did very well in the garmenting sector, and that's a positive development. We take it as a great opportunity. We also have been benefited by the outsourcing, especially in the IT sector. We have these IT companies, TCS, Infosys, and companies like that, which are creating high-end job opportunities for us. TCS now is currently putting up a campus in one of our cities, which is going to employ 24,000 people at a single location. So these models will remain. We need to understand where the opportunity lie, and we have to start training our manpower accordingly. We need to understand how we can take advantage of these new opportunities coming up. Ultimately, it's a question of efficiency of production. And if we have quality trained manpower, they will attract industry and they will get employment.
Okay, fantastic. So, based on Carl, what you're saying there makes a lot of sense. But, are you planning for potential changes? And what are those potential changes that you're foreseeing? And how are you potentially looking to mitigate those risks?
As I said, Madhya Pradesh it used to be primarily an agriculture economy, and our entire focus was on growth in agriculture. But it's a huge population and a young population. We understand that these population cannot be gainfully utilized only in the agriculture sector. We need to create other avenues in which these young population, aspirant population can be gainfully utilized. So under the leadership of Honorable Chief Minister, for the last 3-4 years, we are trying to promote industry. We have created everything that is required by the industry, whether it is availability of land or availability of infrastructure. We also have taken care of the fiscal concessions to support the need of industry, so that the industry comes and our population migrates from agriculture to manufacturing economy. We understand that for a manufacturing sector, you need skilled manpower. So we have put up educational and skilling institutions in our state. We almost produce 70,000 engineers every year, which can be utilized by this industry. So the challenge for us is effectively train and skill our manpower to suit the need of industry which comes to our state. And we see a partnership emerging between the private sector and the government. We address the need of the private sector for the skilled manpower, and in turn, we also benefit by gainfully utilizing the human population that we have.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Ohan, obviously as a leading economist in the region, I'm kind of keen to get your thoughts on this subject. We've heard obviously things are changing, you know, in terms of different models that are being used. What change are you seeing to the models of industrialization in developing countries?
Thank you, David. The model just explained by my colleague actually is something which a lot of GCC countries are trying to do, but they're moving not from an agricultural economy, of course, but going from an oil-based into a non-oil-based economy. But the traditional model of industrialization, so to speak, where currently developed economies went through, moving from subsistence agriculture into labor-intensive manufacturing, into assembly manufacturing, and now into high-end manufacturing, is very, very difficult now, especially in countries like India or China, etc. Why? Simply because the very definition of manufacturing has changed. Manufacturing is not like in the good old days where you have this simple relationship between inputs and output. The service component in terms of design, in terms of research and development, etc., is becoming a much bigger share of the final output of the manufactured output. Another reason I would say is that because of value chains, global supply chains, that the very definition of manufacturing is not done under one roof anymore. You have, for example, just look at your mobiles, okay? It has 150 different parts, and maybe it's done in 150 different locations. So always capital is moving into those sectors or resources in general with the lowest cost, with the highest profitability. So, and this is something new given the market forces. So in the case of India, I would say, although the government and even here governments are really trying to support the private sector, to support specific industries through industrial policies, and trying to use the model of currently successful countries like Singapore, South Korea, etc., using effective industrial policy tools. But it is much more difficult to do that now because of this issue of globalization.
Sure. And if we talk specifically about offshoring and outsourcing, what do you regard as the key drivers for this? I mean, obviously we're talking about supply chains and so on, but how has that changed in recent times?
It has changed in the sense that because offshoring, the rationale or the raison d'etre, the justification for offshoring was low labor costs. But as you pointed out, labor costs are increasing, and there is a rule of thumb: if labor costs are 15% less than your total costs, then it doesn't make sense to offshore. Now, given increases in transportation costs and the loss in innovation and R&D, we have a new term which is known as the reshoring now, and this is what we're seeing to some extent in the US and in more developed countries. So this is the trend now. It's not a very strong trend at the moment, but given the forces of reshoring and given the justification that you want to offshore, not because of to reduce your costs, because you want to access markets, especially in countries which have increased their GDP levels, their per capita income levels, etc. So it's not the good old days in which you want to offshore in order to have a competitive advantage. You want to access markets, and in order to do that, you need to pay attention to the demand for specific goods, to tastes for specific goods. Different cultures have different demands, different tastes, different preferences, and companies, multinational companies, are trying to be closer to these markets in order to tap these large growing middle income groups.
Okay, if we look at more, that's obviously covering the offshoring, outsourcing perspective, but from, the technological advances, do you see these technological advances that companies are introducing being beneficial? Do you think there are advantages to increasing productivity? And what do you see, in terms of what are the implications of these advances, particularly for countries like, the United Arab Emirates and so on? How do you see that?
Whenever I'm asked with a question like this, actually, I remember what Robert Solow said, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, which he said, I see computers everywhere around me, except in the productivity statistics. Now, this is said back in 1987, and tragically, if you look at the historical data from 2001 till today, the rate of growth of productivity has been less than 1%. 1%, 1.5%, and prior to that it was about 2.5%. Now, there is a slow in productivity. Now, one simplistic view is that people are playing with their mobiles more than they are working with their mobiles or with their computers, so to speak. And playing, I mean here, not being productive, being engaged with some other tasks. But the more economic fundamental reason behind it is because you also have an increase in supply of labor. If you look at the definition of labor, of productivity, it's simply output per unit of labor. So I don't want to say output is fixed, but you have at the global level, a big increase in the supply of labor, and this has to some extent affected productivity. Now, in terms of technological advances and the impact on the Abu Dhabi economy or the GCC economies, I think, again, we look at the movement of resources from one sector to another sector. Abu Dhabi and the GCC countries are capital-rich economies, okay? And we are labor-scarce economies. So there is a market force going on there, in the sense that given that the share of labor has fallen in total income, and capital, the cost of capital has been reduced to some extent, this is the comparative or the competitive advantage that future GCC economies have. Because with all due respect, with expat labor, of which I'm one, you cannot forever import labor with all the social issues and the education issues and so forth. But the impact on, now this means that you need to invest in your education, in your health system, etc., what is termed as total factor productivity. Whenever people ask me about the question about productivity, I think, is it labor productivity or the other factors which also go into the production function, like good infrastructure, soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure, governance, which is very important here compared to other developing countries, and more so specifically in Dubai, and that is one of the secrets of success of the Dubai economy, because it pays a lot of attention that government or government offices and government agencies, and to a large extent all over the UAE, they work like businesses with performance indicators and so forth. I don't think you see much of that in the rest of the world. Now, what actually the beneficial side of this is that we can compare this now with the current US administration policy, in which the new administration is trying to some extent to run the economy as a business, and in order to improve productivity and so forth, which can be successful if it's using the right industrial policies.
No, I think that's a very fair point. What I'd like to do now is just, thinking about the theme of this session, and obviously building on what the last session touched upon, is to look really at the automation perspective and the kind of impact that will have. John, you have a very upbeat outlook when it comes to robotics, drone automation. Can you share with us your perspective on this topic and why you are so optimistic about the future with regards to job creation and productivity? Because I think, we've heard some of the stuff there is coming from Ian in terms of the way big data can be used and so on. We've heard about how 20 years or 100 years ago we heard about these changes with the internet and so on. How do you see automation robotics? What are the positivity? What's the cause for your positivity towards the subject?
Well, it seems to state the obvious. The fear of robotics and automation seems to be that it will destroy jobs. Well, if economic progress and well-being were about creating jobs, it would be very simple. We would just abolish the computer, the internet, and the tractor. Everyone would have jobs, but everyone would be intensely miserable and poor, and their standards of living would plummet. What we have to realize is that all technological advances are robots. All technological advances are about destroying jobs. Now, does that put us in breadlines? Quite the opposite, and for obvious reasons. Jobs aren't finite, they're just a function of investment. Where we are becoming more productive, where technology is advancing, that is a magnet for the very investment that leads to new companies and new kinds of job creation. Just reducing this to the absurd, what if someone comes up with a pill that renders cancer yesterday's disease? Would anyone in this room say, oh, well, but we can't do that because that would put oncologists out of work? In fact, I think everyone would embrace such a robot that we could ingest, and then imagine what would happen, all the advances that these great oncologists could bring to us, since they no longer had to focus their energies on something that was yesterday. And then we have to remember the basic point, and this is why we should be so optimistic about this proliferation of automation and robots. The Davos figure is 5 million. Let's hope that it's 100 million. Because we've got to remember that people aren't investing in automation and robots because they don't want anything in return. Say's law is very specific that we produce so that we can get something in return. If in fact automation and robots were going to render all of us unemployed, there'd be no reason to produce them in the first place. We're producing and we're investing so that we can get. The fact that robots and automation signal a massive abundance globally is the surest sign that the future is of massive job opportunities for individuals globally, simply because you've got to produce in order to get what you want. Each side is going to produce, and it's going to be abundant. So, of course, why wouldn't you be optimistic about technology?
I accept I think it's a fantastic outlook and very positive, but obviously it takes time to prepare for this. It can't just happen overnight. I mean, obviously, the upskilling, these new jobs that are going to be created, it's going to take time to create these type of positions, right?
I don't think so, but furthermore, who cares? It would be my answer. I have a computer and I've got a computer in my pocket that Ian Kahn described as a supercomputer. I couldn't tell you how someone put this together, how it got to me in my pocket, but I know that it's the result of global cooperation among hundreds and thousands of individuals. This notion that it's a scary future because of robots defies basic common sense. It's the places that do not embrace automation that are in the biggest trouble, simply because they will repel investment. Look at the United States. Silicon Valley is a creation of constant job destruction. And the result is everyone's got jobs there, and not just people in technology. It's yoga instructors, personal trainers, sommeliers, chefs, investment bankers, attorneys. Everyone works there precisely because they're constantly destroying jobs. Look at Detroit and Flint, Michigan, clean the jobs of the past. Unemployment is massive there, and people are running from those locales in droves. We hear about this transition. The transition's easy simply because where people are embracing production is where investment is greatest, opportunity is greatest. Why we worry about progress is one of life's odd mysteries.
Okay, no, I think I can see where you're coming from in that one there. But, okay, what are the consequences then of this shift in developing economies? You're saying those who don't embrace, you've got to embrace it. What's the consequence of this in terms of the shift from a developing markets perspective? What do these governments need to do?
Why would you have the governments do anything? Explicit in government action is sclerosis. It's the opposite of progress. I can't tell you what the future is going to be specifically. If I could, or if anyone on this panel could, they'd all be billionaires. But what we know is where progress is embraced is where economic growth is most prevalent. If you look at Silicon Valley, 90% plus of the startups funded this year will be dead by next year. So to presume that governments have a role is to make a really odd presumption, simply because with government, nothing ever fails. You keep funding the bad ideas that grow and grow and grow, but that fulfill fewer and fewer needs. We can't prepare for this. All we can do is hope that investment is as abundant as possible so that we can get to the failures quickly on the way to the major successes. If I could tell you it, I'd be lying, and I'd also be a billionaire, and I'm not. But what we know is where people are left alone, investment is greatest, failure is greatest, and as a result, success is greatest.
Thank you, John. I think that's there's something to be taken from that one. I'd like to hand the floor across to Ross there, who has potentially a more cautionary outlook. I don't necessarily say it's a negative outlook, but more of a cautionary outlook on this subject. I mean, Ross, you have experience in the global outsourcing, offshoring services, and IT industries gained in both developed and developing economies. What do you see as the potential threats to emerging markets from this? I mean, obviously, John's covered some of this already, but what's your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, okay. So we really need to pay attention. Now, I speak a lot around the future, but today I'm speaking about the now, because this is happening now. This is not some event which is going to happen in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years' time. The information that was shared from Davos, the 5 million jobs, the data sets are changing rapidly. There's a report from Oxford University, the nature of jobs, and there's a figure, and you might want to write this down, that they're saying 45% of the current jobs today will not be around in 16 years' time. PricewaterhouseCoopers has come out with a figure of a third of the jobs. Now, this is in developed countries. This is not emerging markets. So let's look at Bangladesh as a case study. Now, Bangladesh is reliant quite significantly on exports in the textile industry. Now, I think it's something like 80% GDP, something along those lines. Young people, older people working in the textile industry. It's been very successful, and no doubt many of the clothes we're wearing today, which we've bought in high streets in London, in New York, in Sydney, has come from Bangladesh. Now, what has happened is now we're looking at robotics making T-shirts, robotics making clothes. These clothes are being made in countries like Paris, in countries like London. So the change, the shift, the disruption is now taking work away from countries like Bangladesh. So what does Bangladesh do? Well, if you believe in global warming, Bangladesh is in a pretty awkward situation with rising sea levels, and now a lot of their exports is actually, they're losing that because of automation. It's changing now, and I think we all need to really understand this. I have an outsourcing company. We're in India. We set up our company basically because of low arbitrage, low cost transactional labour services. But we are now investing in robotics and in automation, in live 24/7 type live chats type things. So from John's comment, in developed countries, and I think there's some awesome things happening, and I get excited. But I think where we have industries geared up, which now, and again, this is not over 10, 15 years. I hear people talk about, we need to re-educate our children. No, it's the people in this room, our age group. We're being impacted. It's not our children coming. Yes, they're being impacted. But in a few years' time, some of the things you're doing today won't be around. There's impacts on the legal case, in interns going into legal. What would take maybe 1,000 human hours to do casework is doing like 1 hour in robotics. Now, that's pretty awesome, but that is significant disruption now. So I'm not saying you stop robots, but I need to really say, what do we need to do today? And if I ask a question, what does Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, Steve Bezos, the founder of Amazon, Elon Musk from Telstra and space, and also Professor Stephen Hawking got in common? Well, in the last 60 days, they've gone out independently to talk about the impact on the human workforce, the human capital, as a result of automation and robotics. And these people live and breathe technology. And now they're asking, hang on guys, there's something really big happening right now as we speak.
So I think you're touching on a really interesting subject there, and that's whether, you know, if we come down this situation where jobs are displaced through robots, obviously, I know, John, you don't really care at this stage, but no, in reality though, joking aside, if we go down this route where obviously there's going to have to be some type of basic income for these people who are displaced, who pays for that? And this is a question I want to pose to each of the panelists, and I know this is something that Bill Gates has spoken about recently as well, is who should pay for this? Should robots be taxed? JJ, I want to put that to you first. As a company who's working in this space, you know, what's your view on that subject?
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually. Taxing robots, I'd have to see how it would look on paper before I could comment on that. I think it's an interesting idea. As working for a company that would be employing robots, I don't know, that would, I think, you know, lesser the incentive to go in that direction, which I don't think is a good idea. However, I think that, you know, what as a, you know, company, a private entity, you know, we look towards, you know, the governments or economists to kind of, you know, look at what's going on with technology in society. If you kind of look at the way society is built today, a lot of the basic structures and fundamental ideas were based on, or created in a time before the internet, before robotics, before the thought of AI. So I think, you know, that's something that people have to do, you know, governments, people, human beings. We have to take a look at society and where we're going. And I think there's some restructuring that has to be done in order to kind of allow for these technologies to kind of proliferate and advance into the future.
Sure. I mean, John, just to kind of, you know, what's your view on that point, though, in terms of should companies be footing the bill for this? I mean, what's your perspective on this?
My perspective is, are we really saying that if you have the temerity to fund progress that enhances global standards of living and helps more and more people to emerge from poverty, you should be penalized for it? What an odd thing. And so, should we tax my washing machine? Because realistically, it's a robot, or my toaster oven. It staggers me that Bill Gates promoted what is so ridiculous that it's something that if he'd thought about it, he would rethink it. Taxing robots, he is one of the greatest job destroyers in history through his software. Now, let's be clear about this. When Bill Gates got to Seattle, it was a basket case. It was the Detroit of the United States. They quite literally had a sign up in Seattle in the 70s that said, well, the last person to leave here, turn out the lights. So Bill Gates and Paul Allen return. They create a massive job-destroying technology, robotics in the form of software. Now if you go to Seattle, doesn't matter what your skill level is, there are abundant jobs for you. Why would you tax? Why would you penalize that which creates so much opportunity for all manner of skill sets? It staggers me that we're considering it, but of course we are. This will be part of the discussion. Of course I wouldn't tax robots. I like progress.
Thank you, John. Dr. Ohan, it's a contentious topic, as we can see. It kind of divides opinion. We got those who are saying it's, you know, why? It's crazy.
Yeah,
What's your
basically
thoughts from a
that's
developing market perspective?
It's the classic argument of the role of the government, I would say. And for example, the example of the iPhone, for example. With all due respect to the late Steve Jobs, he did not create the iPhone. And it was not 150 different people who created the iPhone. Who created the iPhone was through seed funding from the government. The technology was there. What Steve Jobs did was to take all these pieces of technology which were already invented and package them, put them in one phone and called it iPhone. So the role of the government now was very important here in terms of funding, seed funding, etc. Now, having said that, you have the recent example of the collapse of a solar company in the US. I forgot the name, Solaris, I think, sorry, what? Cylinder, yeah. So these guys had about $550 million of subsidies, and they went bankrupt because of cheaper solar panels from China. Although the American product was much better, much more advanced, much more efficient, much more environmentally friendly, and so forth. Now, this brings me to the idea of the universal basic income, that governments, in the long run, okay, should pay a universal basic income to all their citizens, not in order to appease them, not in order to please them, to make them more creative. Because I don't think anyone likes his or her job, okay? By definition, this is what I keep telling my children, you know. By definition, work is not leisure. Work is something hard, etc. So maybe this will free resources, more creative resources, and that will have a positive feedback effect. Now, this is where the role of the government, you know, comes in. So taxing, say, form of taxation, a universal basic income, industrial policy, okay, by looking at the successful lessons of Southeast Asian countries, and there is a lot of new economic thinking behind it, and this is what we are doing at the Abu Dhabi Chamber, so to speak. This is in which we are bringing in the private sector. We're using an approach which is known as the embedded autonomy approach, in which we are trying to elicit the challenges from the private sector and convey these challenges and problems to the Abu Dhabi government and try to find solutions. So it's not an exact science, of course. And the thing is that because of changes in technology, and as was pointed out in this panel, we don't know what the future will bring us. We have to be creative, we have to adaptive. We can never have a model, say a tailor-made model, a model which fits all. Each model has to be tailor-made. So this issue of a universal basic income may not work in emerging countries. It may work in developed countries.
Sure. No, thank you for that. Suleiman, just to bring you back in on this one here, what's the perspective? Obviously, I think India is obviously looking at this whole concept of universal basic income at the moment, maybe potentially to replace some of the welfare or whatever it is, but what's your perspective on this?
Well, India, in a way, it's a different country compared to what GCC is. It has a huge population, and the government in India has a social obligation in terms of supporting the basic needs of the large population that it has, especially in the sector of education and health. So government need resources to provide for the basic things that it needs. We may keep saying that ultimately idea of the government is to make itself redundant, but there are certain things which the government will always be obliged to do, and they will have to do that, and they all the time look for resources in this regard. So the taxation is an important aspect of the government. It balances the needs of business with that of the large segments of the society. Especially in our country, income tax continues to be a very important source of income, and it works both ways. There's a personal income tax and there is a tax levied on the company. So if the idea of these mechanization, robotics is to take away from human labor, that means the government loses its revenue from the personal income tax. But at the same time, it results into businesses becoming more profitable, and the income tax to that extent gets compensated. So I believe it will be a very interesting model as and when it comes. I can't have a simple answer whether one should tax them or not, but the larger objective of the government, that it needs resources to cater to huge population and to the basic needs, has to be kept in sight.
Thank you. And Ross, I feel like you're so far away from me down here, but I don't want to leave it with you just to cover what's been left to last, but what's your perspective on this? Do you think they should be taxed?
So my view from a tax point, I think we're going to be seeing, and certainly in Australia, there's conversations around it, but getting into more consumption-based taxes. So as consumers, that's where the tax revenue will be coming from, but as a income earner, potentially that will disappear. And I think what Gates actually was trying to do is curate this conversation. He wasn't sort of, well, who knows what he was saying, but I don't believe he was actually specifically saying tax robots. I think it's really creating this conversation, because let's think about this. If what we understand, or if we're reading this data saying the jobs that we know today are going to disappearing, so I'll speak my country, Australia. So what does that mean? So that means potentially over the next 10, 15 years, the revenue stream for governments to pay for infrastructure, to pay for education, to pay for health, then coupled with that with a growing workforce, an ageing population. So governments will have challenges to collect revenue and provide those means. So potentially, I think this whole thing will start to force the issue around having more goods and service type consumption taxes.
Okay, just very quickly, because I know we're up against time right now, and I want to open it up to the floor, but just a quick one-word answer on the next question. And I'll start with you, Ross. Automation, is it a threat or an opportunity?
Look, it's an opportunity. The change is the threat.
Sorry, one word. Okay, great. Okay, Suleiman?
I really believe that it's a great opportunity. One just need to train its human resource to take advantage of the opportunity.
Great. Dr. Erhan?
Well, definitely it's an opportunity, but it needs to be managed right.
Yep. Okay, John? Oh, no, I don't think I need to ask this question.
Super opportunity.
Super opportunity. Okay. JJ?
Opportunity.
Great stuff. So I think there's a resounding opportunity theme that comes out of this discussion. I mean, I think we're obviously having this discussion today. Maybe we have this discussion next year. It'll be a slightly more evolved discussion. What I would like to do very quickly, I imagine we've got a few minutes, is just quickly open it up to the floor. Are there any questions from anyone in the floor in terms of they would like to ask this panelist about this discussion, about this topic? Over to you. Okay, we've got one question over there. Might have to shout a bit.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, I have a question with regards to how what you're discussing relates to the economic development strategies of a lot of the countries that are present here today. If having a large pool of relatively affordable labor ceases to be an advantage, what does that imply for countries that don't have skills, technology, and that are using, as you said, the traditional approach, or hoping that the traditional approach will help them achieve development? Should those countries simply give up?
I think thank you, Andreas. That's a very good question. Dr. Hahn, I think first of all I'd like to put it to you, then John, and Ross, just to get some different perspectives on this one here. But Dr. Hahn, are you happy to take that question?
Yes, you see, the whole model of diversification and then the industrialization is changing. And these days, these threats, so to speak, of automation, etc., or the uselessness of unskilled labor, so to speak, is being termed as premature deindustrialization. Okay? Now, countries who are suffering now, industrialized countries, they are being deindustrialized. So they are moving from industrialization into deindustrialization, moving into services. Now, countries like India, China to some extent, but Vietnam, the Southeast Asian countries, the lower income groups actually, they're facing the so-called problem of premature deindustrialization. They have not reached the level of income, a high level of income, which fully benchmarks their level of industrialization. Now, in the 80s, when current countries industrialized, that GDP, per capita GDP level was $10,000. These days, countries are being industrialized when their GDP per capita levels are $3,000, $4,000. Now, that, of course, has a lot of implications. Now, for the case of the GCC, it's a very simple equation, because resources, capital flows to places where it has the highest return, okay? Now, given that the GCC countries are capital rich relative to labor, it's only natural or only realistic that these countries will focus on capital intensive products.
Thank you. John, do you want to come in on this question as well? Because I think, again, you know, I understood exactly the points you were making about the opportunity that automation presents and so on. And, you know, there will be consequences, but hey, you know, it'll happen. To Andreas's question there, what's your response to that in terms of developing markets?
Well, implicit in the question is that the labor of today predicts the labor of tomorrow. Thank goodness it doesn't. I'm from the United States. 150 years ago, if you were working, odds are you were working on a farm. As I look at myself, and as I look out at most of you out here, I'm guessing most of you, if your life consisted of farm work, that you'd be objects of pity and ridicule. Certainly I would be. And so this constant destruction is what enables massive new opportunities. My namesake here made the point that we want people to be more creative, that people don't like work. But if you look at where jobs are most rapidly being destroyed, that's where people love work the most. We live in a world right now in which you can make a life of your love of wine. If you love video games, you can make a 7-figure career out of it. If you want to be a video game coach, you can make a career out of that. In the United States today, there are more and more doggy diet consultants for rich families who want someone to consult them on how to feed their pet. What we find is where job destruction is greatest is where productivity is greatest, which means the greatest amount of investment, which means the greatest range of opportunities to elevate all manner of intelligences and skills. You must hope for job destruction. Without it, you have this miserable world described here where people don't like their work. That's what life was like 150 years ago. Thank goodness we've been destroying jobs relentlessly in the 150 years since, so that most of us get to do what we like.
Thank you, John. I'm sure the governments obviously would take a slightly different perspective on that, but I fully understand. Free up our creativity is what you're basically saying, is you think that this job destruction, we will reinvent ourselves, we'll be forced into that change. Just a quick closing word before we wrap up this panel. I realize we're running slightly over time. Ross, do you want to quickly make a quick observation based on the question that came from Andreas?
Well, really the gentleman's question, I think it's probably the critical question we all need to answer, because this is the impact we hear about talking about emerging countries and investments. So if you are from a country where you attract work, you attract commerce to your country because of low labour arbitrage, you'd need to do something today, not tomorrow. You need to rethink that model, that framework, because automation, technology, robots is coming here. And the example I talked about Bangladesh, I could talk about the Philippines and call centres. Now these are people who maybe aren't as educated as the people in this room. Perhaps all they had was a job they got into and they worked their way up, and then overnight that'll change. So these are the impacts, and that's going to happen very fast. So I think what emerging nations need to do is, between government, between educational institutions, between industry associations, is collaborate together. They need to reach out to experts, and they need to act today to start looking at this and this change. It's not to hold it off, but to manage the change.
Thank you. I think on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this session. Just to kind of conclude, I think there was a very clear theme that automation is happening, it's going to stay, it's with us, it's an opportunity, it's not a threat. I think that there's a need certainly in terms of upskilling, there's a need in terms of education. I think the point that Ross made at the end there, collaboration between the private sector, public sector and so on, is so important to help manage this change. So please join me in putting your hands together and thanking this expert panel for their fantastic participation. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Right.